Hi, everybody. Welcome to the latest in our Pluribus Spotlight series. I'm really excited to hear this conversation today because I think it really aligns with our mission at Pluribus News. We aim to spot trends developing in state legislatures across the country, and I know so many lawmakers are considering how they're going to address artificial intelligence in upcoming sessions. And so today we get to hear from the author of the nation's first big landmark AI law, Colorado Senate Majority Leader Robert Rodriguez. Governor Jared Polis signed Senator Rodriguez's bill into law last Friday, and we're thrilled we get to borrow some of his time today. Senator Rodriguez represents Southwest Denver and parts of Arapahoe County and has since 2019. He chairs the Legislative Audit Committee and the Business, Labor, and Technology Committee, along with leading the Democratic majority. So, Senator Rodriguez, welcome, and I'm going to kick things over to my colleague Austin Jenkins to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Reed. Good to see you, Senator. It's nice to chat when I'm not on deadline and you're not trying to pass a bill. So
There you go.
hope you're getting some recovery time after a pretty intense session. So as Reed said, I mean, this bill has been described as the first comprehensive AI regulation law in the country. I do want to note that Utah lawmakers passed a bill as well this year, but people who watch these things closely say yours definitely is the definition of comprehensive. It's also been described as a watershed moment. Why don't you kick us off just by describing what's this bill do? What were you aiming to accomplish with this?
So thank you, Austin. Good afternoon, everybody. The goal of the bill, and it's been a discussion or a topic that's been on my mind for a few years since we passed the comprehensive privacy laws in Colorado a few years back, but it was basically to set up, which we've done interviews here before, that we set up a multi-state task force with my colleague in Connecticut with multiple legislators to start looking at the effects of AI as it's gotten more popular and become more increasingly part of everyday use. The bill is basically a starting point of some regulations and controls that are needed in the AI space. It's mostly pointed to high risk AI and consequential decisions that can cause harm and bias. Basically, what the bill is doing is requiring disclosures to consumers when they're interacting with high risk AI systems, and it gives them the option of getting a report if they were if a decision wasn't made, and it puts some controls that they need to do some type of risk assessments on the systems to make sure that they're being used and safe and tested and adjusted as they find some biases or some bad input in the decisions they're making. Pretty simple as that. It's mostly just a basis of disclosures and accountability.
And so it's really focused on both developers and deployers of AI technology and when it's being used to make consequential decisions about people's lives, right? Employment, housing, healthcare, legal.
Right. Yes. It was mostly targeted in those areas, which is where a lot of times you'll see biases. And anybody that follows this technology knows that that's an inherent problem. And the whole goal was to try to give some openness to consumers while balancing innovation. And if you look into the bill, there's a lot of requirements for the consumers or for the developers and stuff to let people know and to make sure that they're quality testing their systems to make sure that that's being wet out if they find it. But it also gives some rebuttable defense and rebuttable presumption and affirmative defenses in the bill, because knowing that it's going to happen, as long as they're being responsible developers or deployers, that they have an opportunity to just fix it and move forward and not just make a bunch of frivolous lawsuits happen.
You referenced a moment ago your colleague in Connecticut, that's Connecticut Senator James Maroney. And I want to ask you in a minute a little bit more about that relationship. But he wanted his state to be first. He introduced a bill. He'd been working on it for a long time, and he didn't get it across the finish line. He got it through the Senate. You modeled your bill on his and got it not only passed, but now signed into law. So Colorado is the first in the nation. Is that a good thing or a bad thing to be first on this?
I look at it as a good thing. Whenever you're dealing with new technology and stuff, being the first one through to pass a bill is probably one of the hardest. In 2022, I was the third state to pass a comprehensive privacy bill, which was a humongous fight, and it was an improvement on some of the other policies in some places and weaker. And this bill is probably not the strongest and didn't cover everything that we would have liked to have done, but the plan that we found when we did that policy was, the biggest complaint you get as you're running this bills is like, we don't need a hodgepodge of states. We want some type of uniformity. So the whole purpose of the task force and coming up with this policy was to build a baseline and some type of policy framework that could start being followed. And we took information from the EU, we took information from NIST and the federal government, and tried to uniform it as much so tech industries could. And the interesting thing that Senator Maroney and I both did at the process was try to almost, with some slight tweaks, was to identify the policy's uniformity. So, his bill changed, my bill changed with it. And we tried to follow that track that we did along the way. At the end, there were some minor tweaks that I could do. His legislator works a little differently than mine does. He doesn't get to make as many changes when he leaves the Senate. We have the ability for conference and concurrence and different opportunities. Our bills the same bill goes through both chambers. So we had some opportunities to make some tweaks in the other chamber that might have differed from his final bill, but I think it's stuff that will be looked at as other states start doing it. And we still have some work to do probably before the bill gets implemented in 2026.
And we're going to talk more about potential changes in a moment. Now, there's an AI task force through the National Conference of State Legislatures. You've referenced the multi-state working group that you and Senator Maroney and I think legislators from more than half the states were participating in the fall leading up to the January sessions, learning about AI, trying to come up with some common definitions. But take us behind the scenes, because we're used to members of Congress working with colleagues across state lines. But this is an emerging trend of state legislators working with each other. What is this relationship with Senator Maroney like? What does it look like behind the scenes in this work you're doing?
So in 2022, when I had passed the Colorado Privacy Act, the third in the nation, I think California's was enforced for a couple years, and Virginia had passed theirs in March of the same year that mine passed. And I had been running that bill for 2 or 3 years trying to get it done. We couldn't get it done the first year because of COVID. But at the end of session, Senator Maroney had reached out to me and just, hey, I see you're running a bill. And that was kind of the start of our relationship. And he was like, just asked for feedback and, how'd I do it? I explained, it's a bipartisan issue. And, the people that I worked with I thought were transparent when working with me that worked on the bill. And I was like, he's like, well, they're this. And I was like, well, if, I find most of the people you work with is like, they'll give you recommendations, but as a legislator, they never mandate you take their ideas. And it kind of built off of that. And from the privacy bill that he passed last year, it was starting to have discussions about artificial intelligence. And, we had met at a few NCSL conversations and we had talked throughout the time. So it was always kind of just a building thing. I think when I passed the Privacy Act, and it was similar to the lift that this type of bill was, is I had planned to run a biometrics and an AI bill, but it took me a couple years to kind of start building the groundwork. Colorado passed a biometric bill this year, but that was with other legislators because I had put my commitment in this bill, and these kind of bills are really hard to pass because while you're trying to protect consumers, the lift is the bills goes too far or the bill doesn't go far enough. And it's not like you have a coalition of people, going one way or the other thing. And I think the coalition's stance was trying to be balanced and nuanced in a new emerging field of not stifling innovation, but still putting the steps in place for protections for consumers. Those will be built on, I hope for. I think when we pass the privacy law, and as you're seeing new ones passed, I think the goal is for everybody to do a little more research and as it evolves, change it. I passed a children's privacy bill linked to Senator Maroney's children's privacy to catch up. We didn't have biometrics before. We passed that this year. We passed a bill into our Privacy Act about neurological testing or biological testing. So I think this type of technology and this type of policy stuff never stops happening, right? The industry is always going to keep changing. The little nuance I had difference from Senator Maroney is I'm very confident in our AG's department who did the rulemaking for privacy, that he worked in the Department of Justice and had been working in this space for technology and privacy. So I felt comfortable with giving him rulemaking, which I think is a good strength to have because as technology changes, rulemaking can change with it, and definitions can change with it versus having to wait for another session to run a policy to align.
Right. So you passed the law, but there's going to be a whole rulemaking process to implement this going forward. Legislators are talking across state lines, so are governors. We know that your governor, Governor Polis, and Governor Lamont of Connecticut were in touch. I don't know if you were concerned that the governor in Connecticut was urging the governor in Colorado. There's no evidence of this, but what those conversations were like and whether that imperiled whether your bill would get signed. But did that make you nervous to know they were talking?
I was nervous up until the day it was signed. So, yeah, that is, I had conversations with my governor and the departments throughout the process, and a lot of things that they had brought up that got dealt with throughout the process of the bill being tweaked from feedback from industry. It was whittled down to a more narrow scope where it was a broader bill as introduced, but we narrowed it down to what we thought was a reasonable start. A lot of the requests were for a task force, and we need to study this, which for me and some of the task force members that have been doing this since last year,
Because you already have a task force.
we already had a task force, but in Colorado, they're like, well, we were, it was more of a national one, and a lot of the big players were in. Some of the small players got some input at the end, and they still have some input to give through the task force. I've received emails from some of the independent small AI companies that have raised concerns, and I'm like, happy to look at all of this. It's an evolving process, and I think with the governor and Wells creating the task force and addressing his needs and making sure it's like we put this out a couple of years, it gives us time if we need to do tweaks or adjustments.
Yeah, and that's an important point, that this does not take effect until 2026. And so we're going to talk about what's going to happen between now and then. I do want to just ask you, you mentioned the bill got slimmed down. There was a general AI component to this bill and also some language around synthetic media. What happened? Why did those drop out?
I think as you look at any type of newly modeled legislation, and when you're looking at policy, and this bill was always designed to be a floor or a chassis of artificial intelligence. It was like, look, we aren't going to go industry by industry within this bill because that's a huge lift, and it would be a monolith policy, and it would be hard to do that when you have a 120-day session in the legislature, and some have even shorter ones, and some states run every couple of years. A few work year round that can take on this stuff. But as we got harder into it, and the more pushback, and the general purpose AI covers ChatGPT and a lot of bots and a lot more stuff, it became a realization that maybe we should just focus on this high risk consequential decision bias making piece. And then that other piece was still just disclosures and assessments, but maybe we can expand on that. So it was to just go after the more harmful pieces that need probably steps, but I think you'll start seeing other states, and as you've seen bills run on individual small pieces of AI, whether it's deep fakes or ChatGPT or copywriting and all the other stuff that's happening that are more important in different states in their industries. So
do you see in that sense, like privacy, you can get the base bill and then start adding on in subsequent years?
I think it would be very complicated and not smart to start going after artificial intelligence until you do comprehensive privacy policy. All these systems are learned from data and information they check, and you have a basis to have rights with that information. Interestingly, as the federal government and Senator Schumer put out the roadmap to the artificial intelligence risk making, which I've pointed out here, on his one pager, the second bullet point was to regulate and stuff and bias. The second to last bullet point of regulating AI was to pass a comprehensive data privacy law. So, and that's kind of why it's, I think the argument is there is like, we'd love to see a federal policy, but as somebody who's been in the space of privacy and this stuff since I passed it 2-3 years ago, and that was the third state. Now we're at like maybe 20. The federal government still has yet to pass a comprehensive privacy law. So, I think it's upon the states to take this on to protect their constituents and look at some simple modifications and being responsive to a small emerging industry. This stuff is really cool, and the things it can do are great and awesome, but it's just like, anytime you build or develop a product, there needs to be some accountability and responsibility with it.
Just to be clear, though, would you imagine coming back and adding, for instance, general AI guardrails or components to this existing base law in your state?
The task force that we committed, I think, will be a topic it discusses. That's the conversation that need to be had. That this bill passed, I'm pretty committed to making sure that this gets done right and we tweak it out. I have interests in other pieces of this high risk AI. That was the reason that I looked into this bill, was because we needed to set a common floor, and then you build upon it as industries start evolving this technology. So it's not something I'm opposed to, but the conversations haven't been dug into enough to make sure we can do it. So unless I see some consensus or something we need to attack, maybe so. I was like, just this week with Chat GPT and the conversations in California with using a voice, and this stuff's happening faster than we can regulate it. So I always hope other states take on models, and as legislators we get to borrow, build, improve, or correct those models. I hope that's the plan that happens across the country, but starting with a base policy seems to be a good route to go.
Well, there was some suspense about whether the governor would sign it. He did, but he also issued, along with his signature, a pretty extraordinary letter saying he was signing the bill with reservations. And he had a series of concerns about the way it's written. He urged you and others to get back to sort of next year, some changes to it before it goes into effect. But one of his main criticisms was that this would hold AI developers accountable for systems that discriminate, whether intentionally or not. And he noted that most anti-discrimination laws focus on intentional discrimination. So I'm just very interested in that specific criticism. Why?
I think I met with the governor prior to the signing, and I committed to him that is obviously my goal, which was my earlier commitment. It's like, look, I commit to get this right and tweak it. I was like, I think there's criticisms, and his comments were more of probably from the tech industry side, and the hindrances of what'll do to the innovation. But some of the other arguments that didn't get as much attention, that are controversial, is also the consumer protection side. A lot of them don't feel this bill gives enough protections, and trying to find that balance within the bill is kind of my goal as I move forward. I understand his reservations. He had a similar signing statement when we passed the privacy law, and they're always like, this is going to stop business. It's like, these bills are passing in multiple states, and industry has not been harmed, and they've pushed into this new technology. And I think that's a lot of the stuff you have to deal with as a legislator, is everything's going to end the world as we know it. And from my few years, and I have a few lumber years because we have term limits in Colorado, but sometimes we take ourselves a little too seriously, and we do something, and putting a long runway to starting it was a first step. But we can always make changes and tweaks as things come up. And I think the rulemaking piece is going to help that. So it's a new thing for him, and it's scary, and he gets a lot of pressure and pushback to veto it. A lot of national groups pushed on him to veto it. I think there's a lot of push for this not to pass. It was the same thing with privacy, and the tech companies want a federal program as well, but states have to take the lead. And I think if you look at some of the federal policies that are being passed now, I was reading through the Privacy Act this weekend. A lot of it incorporates a lot of the policies that states have already taken on. So hopefully we're setting a framework and a groundwork for the federal government to come in and do some tweaks and adjustments.
What about the argument, and he again made this, that this creates a complex compliance regime? You had small AI startups or smaller AI startups in your home state saying this was going to hurt them, and they might even think about going elsewhere. How do you respond to those criticisms?
I would say the devil's in the details. Colorado, I can't imagine Colorado is not a super large marketplace and not a super small marketplace. I would be interested to see if people will actually leave Colorado for this workplace. I would think it's more interesting to hear that somebody that's building a technology or as a product, that they're building a product that you don't want to make sure that you're putting out a good quality product, and that it could cause harms, and just say, well, we'll just figure that out after it happens. And what harms does that cause, and how does that get replicated? I don't know if that's the right approach, but I think anytime, especially, that's why this bill was narrowed down to focus to the high-based decision-making. Shouldn't that be an expectation of we have all these kind of products in this work that's being done with these tools?
So let's kind of kick this forward and help us see around the corner to, you've built in some time. You can go back and take a look at this law in 2025. It doesn't go into effect till 2026. You mentioned rulemaking. What is your, I mean, I realize it's the ink is hardly dry on this, but what is your willingness and appetite to go in and start making changes? Like, what's that process going to look like over the next 12 months? 2 months?
I think the first meeting, we set up a task force under a separate bill. It's got about 24 or 25 people. It's going to be interesting because it's going to be a very large one. But we took, as the bill was coming out and when the bill was looking at, they're like, we need a task force, you can put it in your bill. We had another mechanism bill running from a task force they were tweaking from facial recognition that was like a little more outdated than where we are in the technology and it was formed.
Mhm.
And we put the task force in that bill, and we asked the tech industry and we asked the consumer advocates and the labor unions to all give us a wish dream list of the people they want at the table. And we took that list and merged it together and created a task force so we can start having these broader conversations. I think it's a nice place to be in the sense that the bill's passed versus not, because you see a lot of states and many legislators know when your bill doesn't get passed, they're always recommending a task force. It's not always the right answer. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But I think the fact that we have a bill that is going to go into effect gives a lot of control and thoughtfulness from the industry and consumer people to come to the table to say we have to come up with some deals and some compromises to make sure we're doing a balanced policy so it doesn't beat up both sides.
Some have said this is the cart before the horse. You should have a task force and then write the bill and pass it.
We had a task force and there was a lot of stakeholdering. It's like, is it ever enough? No. As you see privacy stuff and other bills that are into this new technology, and it's always evolving and it's always changing and you're always changing with it. This bill was never intended to be the end all be all. This is just a simple bill of disclosures and accountability. This isn't a bill saying you must do this, you must do that. All it says is you have to tell people if you're interacting and that you're taking some controls to be responsible developers of a product, that you're taking the controls to make sure it's safe.
So what do you predict will come out of the task force? Do you think there will be fresh legislation, tweaks to this existing law, a repeal and replace?
I don't know if we need to repeal and replace. I mean, there might be some tweaks to maybe definitions or clarifications that are needed. That there's a lot of questions that it's too broad, and I'm happy to get those discussions and do it. But if we've missed something, a lot of this is framework that's already, whether it's in NIST or the EU, the EU AI bill. A lot of this stuff is framework that's already being implemented. So if there's tweaks that need to be made or tweaks that happen along the way, I'm happy to do it. Which I don't know if I think that this bill is going to be transformative or look at other broad coverages. If there's something that comes up, I'm also one legislator of 100. Somebody else can run a bill. So that can always happen. Somebody can run a bill on deep fakes or somebody can run a bill on copyright. There's going to be expansions on industries. I'm interested in HR decision making because I think that's a field where this industry's at that cause problems. Some people will look at banking. Some people will look at healthcare. But this bill is mostly, like I said, is about just disclosures and just making sure you're reviewing your data, similar to we did in data privacy. It's a risk-based.
Are you hearing yet from other state legislators around the country who might be interested in adopting this framework?
I think there's multiple legislators that were in the multi-state task force that are interested in looking at this, as you've had other ones. Some of the other interviews we've had with members of that task force is good. I've had a few reach outs. Look, session ended 2-3 weeks ago. I got on a plane and left the country for a week just to do, and then I came back and the bill got signed. So right now I'm committed to start digging into the task force. If other states want to reach out, I think there's plenty of us that want to do this work that are going to look at. And similar to my relationship that I built with Senator Maroney, I think that will happen amongst many of us as it happens. A lot of us that are in this space kind of somewhat know each other. It's bigger and broader, but it's also one of the shiny objects of policy right now. So there's a lot of new players coming into it, which is exciting and good because some of us, my Privacy Act was based on a Washington model that the senator who modeled it never got it passed in his state. And
Senator Reuben Carlisle.
Reuben Carlisle, who is the grandfather of the privacy law that I thought was a balanced approach, because at the time it was different. And I don't claim that my bill is going to answer all the questions, and I'm here as one person in one state starting a conversation that I hope my colleagues across the country can dig into more and improve and strengthen and keep the balance for consumer protections and innovation.
Just one last question. You have indicated that states are taking the lead here in AI. They took the lead on privacy. Congress hasn't acted. There is an argument you hear from industry in particular that we shouldn't, with AI, do a wash and repeat and rinse of what we did in privacy, and that there shouldn't be a patchwork of laws, and time should be given to Congress to act. There's clearly interest in Congress. Your own congressional delegation, in particular Senator Bennett, has been very, very keenly interested in this topic. Is there an argument for you guys to slow down and hold off and let a federal solution emerge? Are you having conversations with your delegation about this?
I have not. I know Senator Bennett has had conversations. I've not had conversations with him directly. I know Senator Hickenlooper, I think, is on the task force. I am open to all those conversations. The people nationally that are complaining about it are usually the people in DC, that whether that gets introduced and what ultimately gets passed is something we all hope for. Like I said, in the 5 years that privacy started in California, we still have yet to, they introduce one every year and it never gets to the finish line. So I am open to the federal government doing this work, but I think many times we see it get stalled, and this is a political election year. So what are the odds that AI gets addressed this year? And what I found with privacy, and whether you follow GDPR, is that we waited so many years that so much information and data was taken, and consumer and people's privacy rights were taken. The longer you wait, the harder it is to unravel. Whether it's healthcare or whether it's technology. I was like, the longer you wait, the more it becomes ingrained. And then how do you unravel it once it's just become such a part of our system? So I think privacy is where the idea is like, okay, AI is this new emerging exciting thing, but we just need to make sure it's responsible and done right. And I think states are taking action sooner rather than later, because there's not a time that I don't look, and maybe because AI now regulates my feed, I see a lot of articles and things that are happening across the country, whether it's harms or new innovations with AI. So I think the time is always right to look at it. If the feds come up with a policy, then I'm more than happy to. If they reach out, I'm happy to be a part of it. I think I did get some outreach from the White House to reach out to some other legislators across the country that are convening in this space. So I did tell them I'm happy to talk with anybody. And I think the key to all these policies is not to just think everything, because as many of us as legislators our ocean is a mile wide, or rivers or lakes a mile wide and an inch deep, and unless you really know something about something you come out of, there's always opportunities to learn and improve.
Yeah. Well, bottom line, the governor says there are opportunities to significantly improve this bill before it takes effect.
Yeah, I don't disagree. The question is which opportunities and which of the improvements direction are we looking to go in?
And to that end, you've got industry saying this is a complex matrix to have to figure out, and you've got privacy groups, civil society groups saying it's not, consumer advocates saying it's not protective enough.
Sometimes when both sides are feeling a little pain, you're in a good place.
And so your appetite for a radical surgery of this new law before it takes effect versus some minor surgery?
If we find needs for minor surgery and tweaking, yes, I think the base framework I said is disclosures and accountability. I don't, strengthening it or tweaking it to make it more workable is a good thing for both sides. The consumer groups want more transparency. The tech side wants more definition and division. I think we can find a balance with that.
Yeah. I'm going to toss it back over to Reed. See what I
right.
missed. Maybe he has a question or two, or maybe we'll just wrap it up. Maybe the audience has some questions.
I thought
Thanks,
that
Senator.
Yeah. Excuse me. Senator Rodriguez, thank you so much for doing this today. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you guys.
All right. And thanks to everybody who was here with us. Please stay tuned. We've got a lot more of these events to come, and probably on the same topic when Senator Rodriguez's bill filters its way to 45 other states. And we'll see. We'll have you back, and you can critique everybody else's bill. How about that?
Good luck to all of you if you do that. That's all I got.
All right. Thanks, everybody, again. I hope you have a great Memorial Day weekend, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.